We finally know why Akira Toriyama continued Dragon Ball, what he wanted from the Cell arc, how he got his creative spark for the Buu arc, and what his final thoughts were on Dragon Ball Super. This is all coming from an interview with the legendary editors at Dragon Ball, Kazuhiko Torishima, Yu Kondo, and Fuyuta Takeda. Let's go ahead and jump into the interview and get some more insight into Dragon Ball. We finally have confirmation that Toriyama wanted to end Dragon Ball with the Cell arc. During the final phase of the Cell saga, Toriyama repeatedly expressed his intention to end Dragon Ball with that narrative arc. Initially, those who heard him did not fully understand his will, thinking that even if the Cell saga concluded, the series could continue in another way. However, strong pressure came from the editorial team for the story to go on, pushing Toriyama to continue further. And with that, honestly, we have the editorial team to thank for that, because if that was the final arc, if Cell Saga was the ending to Dragon Ball, we would have never gotten the Buu saga and beyond, and Dragon Ball would have quite literally ended right there and then. There is nothing that says that Akira Toriyama had a secret apprentice or would pass on the series to anybody else, so I'm glad that these editors decided to push Akira Toriyama, even though he felt like he wanted to do other things than Dragon Ball. Ultimately, it was his choice to continue, but he did get a little bit push from the editorial team. Despite this, Takeda always sided with the author, trying to find ways to ease his workload and make the continuation of the series less burdensome. In the end, both Toriyama and Takeda insisted that the story should definitely conclude with the end of the Majin Buu saga, out of respect for Toriyama and his desire to bring the series to a close, which is what kind of happened. Toriyama's final fun, the creative spark behind Majin Buu saga. During the final phase of Dragon Ball, Toriyama was asked if he truly enjoyed designing new characters, to which he replied that he actually preferred creating rounder, cuter figures with a humorous touch. Yeah, we saw that with Goma, we saw that with Sino, that makes sense. This reflection led to the idea of creating a villain with those characteristics, Majin Buu. As the Buu saga took shape, Torishima kept insisting that the series should have ended earlier. However, despite this, Toriyama seemed to be having a lot of fun working on it. This was particularly evident in the absurd gags reminiscent of earlier Toriyama, such as Gotenks Ghost Kamikaze Attack, which left the editor both astonished and perplexed, but it was clear that the sensei was enjoying this final part precisely because he knew the story was coming to an end, or so he thought, I guess. He thought that this was it, and as we are now in 2025, and unfortunately Toriyama has passed, Dragon Ball still continuing. Yeah, who would have known, who would have thought that it would end with Dragon Ball Daima, at least when it came to Toriyama having some sort of influence on it. Toriyama wanted to conclude the Buu saga within a few weeks. I can see that, seeing as how like the beginning of the Buu saga feels disjointed from the rest of it, I guess. Towards the end of the Cell saga, Toriyama had probably intended to conclude Dragon Ball within a few weeks, perhaps 3 or 4. In the end, however, the series continued for another 2.5 years. He might have thought of wrapping everything up in 6 months, but the story ended up lasting much longer than expected. Rather than convincing him to continue, the editors focused on finding ways to make the work more enjoyable for him. Their approach was more along the lines of, let's try adding something fun to this arc so you can enjoy it a bit, aka Buu and Kid Buu and all those things. A key example of this was Mr. Satan. The idea of making him central and exaggerating his stupidity was introduced specifically to add a comedic effect that could lighten the tone, and ironically, in the end, he was the one who saved the world, and he's still a fan favorite. To this day, everyone knows who Mr. Satan is, and they know to put some respect on his name. Why Toriyama shifted Dragon Ball's tone, a big one here. Previously, under Kondo's management, management, the structure of the series was clear. A powerful new villain was introduced, leading to an epic showdown with Goku. Great. Don't fix what ain't broken. But after repeating this pattern with Frieza and Cell, Toriyama seemed to grow tired of this type of storytelling. He felt that he had already given enough in terms of battles and ruthless antagonists, which is why the Majin Buu saga took on a more comedic tone, resembling a Dr. Slump in style. This shift in tone was, in a way, inevitable. The Cell saga had become increasingly complex, with time travel and paradoxes, creating a difficult narrative structure to manage. Absolutely, people are still trying to manage it to this day. If a mistake was made in the chronology, it became nearly impossible to correct it without generating further inconsistencies. As the story progressed, it became evident that things had gotten more and more tangled, and honestly, the Black Goku arc does not fix any of that at all. It makes it even worse. In the podcast here, they talk about how great Back to the Future is. As a result, the Majin Buu saga became a sort of reaction to that excess complexity. Toriyama and his editors decided to remove narrative complications. No more paradoxes, no more intricate logic. Instead, they opted for a simpler, lighter structure filled with gags. In hindsight, this was probably the best choice to conclude the series in a freer and more enjoyable way. During the conversation, Toriyama was asked whether he actually enjoyed drawing certain characters. He replied that Kondo had always told him that if a character wasn't cool, it wasn't good enough. At that point, the discussion shifted to Frieza, revealing that he was actually a forced character, one that Toriyama hadn't particularly wanted to create, but was made to include. That is something I did not know, that Toriyama never wanted to create Frieza. However, when a story undergoes sudden changes, such as when Toriyama himself requested to move on to a new opponent because he no longer wanted to draw Frieza, it can complicate the plot structure and lead to somewhat chaotic situations, which I can see 100% that he wanted to move on from Frieza, because Frieza is literally one note, in my opinion. He isn't very complex, and we haven't gotten a story where he is complex at all. I think the most complex that he's been is the Tournament of Power, where he's wrestling with decisions of helping out the good guys, I guess, and being on the good guys team, fighting for Universe 7. But ultimately, I can see why Toriyama did not like Frieza, but at the same time, I can see why he was pushed to do so. So Dragon Ball itself isn't just the story of Toriyama. It is the story of Toriyama, and I'm assuming his manager, his editors, and everybody who worked over there in his department at Shueisha who pushed him one way or the other. So it's not just Akira Toriyama's vision, it is all their vision. The famous anecdote about Cell, even though Kondo didn't like him, Toriyama wasn't actually forced to change his design. In the end, though, Toriyama's mind always finds a way to keep the story moving. Often when reorganizing the narrative, it makes seem like certain ideas came from him or someone else, but in reality, it's just a process of simplification and adjustment, exactly as Kondo had suggested. Therefore, it's important to be mindful of how certain narrative changes are interpreted. It is often said that Kondo shut down the idea of Cell, declaring that it was all worthless. But in reality, things didn't go exactly that way. It wasn't a complete rejection, but rather a critique of the character's design. Initially, Cell had an appearance very similar to a large cicada-like insect, and Kondo expressed some doubts. He didn't seem like a particularly cool opponent. I think he was just so used to like the designs like Final Form Frieza and the Saiyans like that actually look really cool. If you look at some of the original artwork for Cell though, I mean, I can see where he was coming from because it's really, really ugly and not scary at all. It's like that giant monster that Goku fights that sucks energy in the Buu saga, and when they were in Babbidi's ship, like how that character doesn't seem like a cool character to fight. That's probably how I would say the original Cell designs were. The judgment changed Okay, so wait. However, when the character took on a more humanoid form, the judgment changed. This design felt more fitting, more charismatic, and better suited for an exciting battle. So he didn't like that the Saiyans or any of the heroes were fighting basically monsters. He wanted them to be more human, which makes sense at the time with anime such as and manga such as Yu Yu Hakusho and things like that, Inuyasha, where the villains are more humanoid. I can see where back then it was like you need to have a character look more human for him to be intimidating. Giants don't attract Toriyama, who before leaving us only created giant villains. The idea was that an antagonist that was too monstrous wouldn't engage the audience as much, one with a more human-like appearance. This is exactly what I just said. This observation was based on direct experience with Dragon Ball. For example, during the Great Ape transformation, it was initially believed that a battle featuring a giant monkey would excite readers. However, in reality, popularity polls plummeted. In conclusion, as Kondo emphasized, was clear: the audience found fighting between humanoid opponents of similar size more compelling because they created greater tension and engagement, which I think it's true to this day. I don't like it when actually it's true to this day with even superhero. People wanted the Cell Max to go into his final form, including me, to look more like Perfect Cell, because that would have been cooler. And that, to me, I still think they should have done that. But I can see like that people just want that, and especially with Dragon Ball, they want more humanoid characters, and that's exactly what essentially they gave them. P.S. Ironic, considering that the final villains of Dragon Ball would eventually end up being giants. I know. Here they're talking about Dragon Ball villains. The idea of Frieza as a space merchant and galactic villain emerged during a brainstorming session, but at first, there was no clear defined character. The concept of an intergalactic evil businessman was strong and universal because it immediately established his role. A ruthless villain in Dragon Ball, clear-cut roles were best. The good guys are good, the bad guys are bad. Toriyama was never inclined to create intricate plots with double-crossed and elaborate twists. Instead, he would drop hints without developing complex backstories. So there was basically no backstories essentially for Frieza at all, and there still really isn't. His storytelling styles was simple and direct, aimed at a young audience, without excessive flashbacks or long-term mysteries to unravel. When a plot needed a twist, he often introduced new ideas suddenly. For example, the revelation that Goku was a Saiyan wasn't the result of an elaborate plan, but a narrative necessity. When the story hit a roadblock, Toriyama quickly found a solution. So I guess, that would have been in the Saiyan saga, right? Why would Raditz be coming back to Earth? Why would he need to? Well, why does he have a tail? Well, Goku has a tail. I'm assuming that. I'm not. They haven't said that yet, but I'm assuming that's the thinking behind that. Toriyama's approach. This method led to unexpected surprises, such as the destruction of Namek. At that point, a problem arose. If the planet was gone, then the Dragon Balls would be too. But the solution came immediately with the introduction of another Namekian who could recreate them. This spontaneity defined the entire creative process. It was no long-term planning. We Dragon Ball fans know. Toriyama and the editors would decide on the general direction and then develop the story week by week. Even the ideas of setting part of the story in space emerged suddenly. If Goku was an alien, then it made sense to explore new planets. Iconic elements like Goku's tail were not originally conceived as part of his Saiyan heritage, but were later tied into it with the story when the story required. This approach also influenced the structure of the martial arts tournaments. Toriyama wanted to surprise the audience. In a typical setup, the strongest fighters would face off in the finals, but in Dragon Ball, the decisive duel could happen in the first round. This often led the editors confused. What happens after that? But Toriyama, true to his philosophy, would simply respond, "If I put the most epic fight first, then I'll just come up with something else." I love this man. He's so freaking cool. His priority was to surprise the reader, create something unexpected, and not to worry too much about long-term consequences. So he didn't really try to tie stories together. That's for other people. That's for other creators. He just is like, I'll just do something else. We'll do something else. The ability to subvert expectations and improve solutions made his storytelling fresh and unpredictable. His goal wasn't to build perfectly structured plot, but to surprise and entertain, always leaving readers eager to see what would happen next. Toriyama didn't show Gohan in high school for the audience, but because he got bored and tired of it. During the Buu saga, there was a moment when Toriyama decided to experiment with a different idea. The school chapter featuring Gohan in high school and the Great Saiyaman. The idea was to try a lighthearted storyline with Gohan attempting to hide his identity while experiencing small, everyday adventures. However, after a few weeks, Toriyama got bored and abruptly abandoned it. As often happened, if something became too complicated or unstimulating, he would drop it without much hesitation. The school setting required many crowd scenes filled with background characters, something Toriyama found tedious and time-consuming to draw. I would too. So to make the work simpler and more enjoyable for himself, he quickly cut that storyline and moved on to something very dynamic and absurd. This tendency towards improvisational storytelling is also evident in the introduction of Trunks. And it's crazy how quickly that storyline in Dragon Ball's Buu arc ends with the just abandonment of the school plot and the Great Saiyaman arc and Gohan trying to hide his identity with the World Martial Arts Tournament. It just completely is over after that in the Buu saga, and then we just roll right into something else, which I personally think that's like one of the best aspects of Toriyama, even though it leaves a lot of plot holes, it leaves a lot of open-ended questions, and it just feels so random. It fits. It just definitely fits. And to me, this is all seeming like Akira Toriyama had ADHD or something, because he's just going from one thing to another thing. If he got bored of it, he just ended it and moved on to the next thing that made him more entertained and got him more excited. Okay, Bulma marries Vegeta. What? When Trunks first appeared, effortlessly wiped out Frieza, no one, not even Toriyama, had yet decided exactly who he was. There was no long-term plan for him to be the son of Vegeta and Bulma. It was only later that Toriyama made this connection and declared, okay, Bulma marries Vegeta for the editors. This was a complete shock. Up until that point, Bulma had shown no particular interest in Vegeta, so the revelation that they would have a child left them stunned. Some suggested that the relationship should be explained in more detail, but Toriyama, in his usual spontaneous style, brushed it off with a casual, more or less. This was his philosophy. Don't overplan. Introduce ideas suddenly. And if something became inconvenient or boring, change it on the spot. His goal was always to surprise the reader while also making his own work as simple as possible. This, in my opinion, may be the greatest spontaneous change or creative choice that Akira Toriyama ever made in his story, in my opinion, in my humble opinion, because this, as a child, came out of nowhere. Because as soon as I saw Trunks, as soon as I saw him transform and defeat Frieza and King Cold, I was already sold on him. I knew this is one of my favorite characters. He's so freaking cool. He's a teenager. I'm a teenager. Like, this guy's awesome. And then for him to tell Goku out of nowhere that he is Vegeta and Bulma's son is insane, because up until that point, there was no connection between Bulma and Vegeta. So that means their love story would have had to happen after after we saw that story, after we saw this story specifically. And without Trunks, without Bulma and Vegeta getting together, so many different plot elements just fall apart. And Bulma being a main character, honestly, like the way she is, she wouldn't be there. Vegeta being a hero, more likely wouldn't be there. So cool that he sent the material already finished, leaving them with little room to make changes. The working process with Toriyama was quite unique compared to other mangaka. Manuscripts were sent via fax, but not as simple storyboards to be corrected. They were already nearly final. The editors would receive them, take a look, and generally approve them without too many changes. If they asked what would happen in the next chapter, the answer was always the same. Who knows? We'll see next week. This is like, if I was making manga, this is the energy that I'd want. Like, yeah, we don't know. I don't know. I'll figure it out. Toriyama wasn't the type to do multiple drafts or engage in lengthy discussions over revision. Unlike other authors who work closely with editors to refine and adjust the story, he trusted his own creative process, worked independently, and delivered the final product without wanting to revisit it. However, editors like Torishima and Kondo were much stricter. If something didn't work, they wouldn't hesitate to send it back to the drawing board with a firm Zenken Dame. Absolutely not. Takeda, on the other hand, took a different approach. They were genuinely stunned by Toriyama's unusual way of doing things. Knowing that Toriyama wanted to end the series, Takeda's goal was to make things as easy as possible for him, avoiding excessive pressure, but the recurring challenge remained. Okay, this chapter is done, but what about next time? What's going to happen? This constant uncertainty was the real struggle for Dragon Ball editors, as Toriyama's creative process was completely instinctive and unpredictable. That is so freaking heavy. You don't understand. I can completely see now why people who aren't fans like I am, or like others are, of Dragon Ball, or they just like Dragon Ball a little bit, or they don't like it at all, I can see why. Because there is no connections, there is no thought through story. It is just random stuff happening, kind of random attacks, random things, situations, story elements. For most of the time, no explanation. I can completely see why people who aren't huge fans of Dragon Ball, why they aren't, because of all those things. But at the exact same time, that's the reason that I love Dragon Ball, because it is so random, it is so freeing through like the story elements and the backstories. You can theorize Dragon Ball all day long. That's why there's so many YouTube channels that are what if channels that blow up and are huge, because the way Dragon Ball is, you can theorize all day long on what events could take place, were taking place, and what the past was, and things like that, backstories. I mean, I absolutely love Akira Toriyama's way of doing things. The transformation of Dragon Ball into a battle manga. The transformation of Dragon Ball into a battle manga happened gradually, but not entirely by choice. In its earlier stages, the series balanced adventure, comedy, and combat, but with the arrival of the Saiyan saga, the focus shifted more and more towards battles, pushing the story into prolonged high-intensity action. This change was driven by the audience's response. Readers were thrilled by the fights and wanted to see more. Toriyama, initially more interested in adventure comedy, hadn't planned this shift from the start, which is great with his style of doing things. I mean, it just came back and bit him in the ass a little bit here. However, once he experimented with it, he found it fun to develop increasingly spectacular and elaborate battles. It wasn't just a matter of let's introduce a new enemy and have him fight Goku. There was an evolution in character dynamics as demonstrated by Vegeta's arc. Toriyama was very competitive. Initially, the main antagonist Vegeta eventually joined the protagonist when Frieza threat emerged. This kind of development enriched the narrative, moving beyond simple villain of the arc structures and creating more complex interactions between characters. The editorial team debated whether the former enemy turned ally formula would work, and they eventually realized it added depth to the story. Absolutely. Toriyama himself thought he didn't plan everything far in advance, let himself be guided by audience reactions. He wasn't the type to obsess over popularity polls, but when results were shared with him, his competitive spirit drove him to improve. Despite his image as a laid-back person, Toriyama actually had a strong competitive nature. Makeru Girai, hate to lose. This aspect of his character pushed him to create increasingly impressive fight scenes, never settling for less. Toriyama wasn't too happy about restarting Dragon Ball. Here we go, guys. So even though Dragon Ball wasn't exactly the manga he had originally dreamed of drawing, once he embraced that direction, he gave it his all to make it the best it could be. About 10 years ago, when the idea of doing something new with Dragon Ball was proposed, Toriyama responded with little enthusiasm, saying he didn't find it fun anymore. He didn't feel obligated to continue, but the motivation that had driven him in the past was no longer there. Even in a tribute interview on the radio, he admitted that he had no longer felt the same excitement as before. Sure, he still enjoyed working with certain characters, but his engagement wasn't what it used to be. During the Buu saga, or even towards the end of the Frieza saga, that creative spark was still evident. He was full of ideas and energy. Over time, however, subtle changes in storytelling became noticeable, signaling that his approach was shifting and that his inspiration was no longer as strong. It's really sad to see, but it happens to all of us. Toriyama x Katsuro x Torishima. The relationship between Toriyama, Katsuro, and their editor, Torishima, was built over time, marked by moments of tension but also deep mutual respect. When Katsuro recounted past episodes where it seemed like Toriyama had endured some editorial harshness, Toriyama himself would react with surprise, saying, "Oh really? That happened?" Only realizing later how tough those moments might have been. Over time, Toriyama and Katsuro developed a deep understanding of each other, having both worked under Torishima. They shared similar experiences, and although they occasionally complained about his decisions, it was more about recalling anecdotes than harboring any real resentment. In fact, the fact that they spoke negatively about him wasn't out of bitterness. It was actually proof that the profound impact he had on their careers. The importance of Torishima and Toriyama and Katsuro. The dynamic was clear. The more they discussed his absurd directives, the more it became evident that Torishima had left a lasting imprint on their artists' journeys. It was a kind of affection disguised as critique, a way of acknowledging his importance without openly admitting it. After all, these weren't stress-induced outbursts or genuine complaints, but rather a form of long-standing trust. Katsuro and Toriyama, despite moments of frustration, would never disown Torishima's crucial role in their careers. On the contrary, the fact that they spoke about him so often was proof of just how much they respected and appreciated him. The difficulty of coordinating the manga with anime, video games, and merchandise. Oh, this should be good. At Jump Editor's office, we tried to synchronize the weekly serialization of the manga with the release of the collected volumes, the anime, merchandise, and video games every week. There were meetings with companies like Bandai and game developers who asked us to plan product launches around key moments in the story. However, Toriyama didn't work with a fixed schedule and often responded with vague, I haven't really decided on all the details yet. Perfect, classic Toriyama. This made coordination be difficult because if he suddenly decided to change the direction of the story, the anime, merchandise, and video game plans had to be adjusted in a hurry. Sometimes we would get panicked calls like, "Hey, what do we do now?" Even the covers of the collected volumes, Tankoban, and their content influenced the merchandising strategy. The Dragon Ball universe. For example, a certain character was chosen for the cover, Bandai might plan to release a figure based on them, but if Toriyama suddenly changes his mind about that character, the entire release schedule would shift. Coordinating the weekly serialization, the anime, and the Tankoban, and the merchandise was an almost impossible task, especially if he's changing all the details throughout. Dragon Ball was so popular that requests for collaborations and new products kept piling up. Sometimes the editors wondered if they were still working as editors or had become video game planners instead. Despite the challenges, it was an exciting time. Seeing Dragon Ball expand in so many directions was incredible. What did they want to do? Occasionally, depending on Bandai's needs, there were discussions about whether a particular character should get more screen time at that moment, or conversely, whether their appearance should be delayed to avoid spoilers. But with everything developing in parallel to serialization, predicting the timing with precision was practically impossible, exactly. Especially, again, with the randomness, how would you even plan that? For a Jump anniversary, the editorial team came up with a crazy idea, stacking all the issues of the magazine until they reached 25 meters in height. Using a fire department ladder truck, however, the wind threatened to scatter the volumes, so they had to tape them together to keep the stacks intact. It was an absurd feat, but it perfectly represented Jump's spirit, going big with enthusiasm and a touch of madness. While some questioned the purpose of it all, the answer was simple. That's exactly the point. Madness is fun. The birth of Jump's various collaborations. This same approach was reflected in the desire to engage fans not just in reading manga, but also in playing with characters. The editorial team spent many meetings figuring out what kids enjoyed outside of manga. And from these discussions, ideas like collectible cards, cartas, and video games were born. The goal was to turn the Jump experience into something more interactive and enjoyable, expanding the world of the characters beyond the pages of the magazine. And that is the end of part 1 of this interview. There is another part. This is an hour-long interview, I'm assuming, because of how long it's already taken me to go through it. So stick around, and I will have the next part out as soon as possible.